Hello, my name is Matt Bernhard, and I'm here to talk to you today about risk limiting audits and some recent work that I have done, systematizing some of the work that's already been done, as well as thinking about threat models around risk limiting audits. So who am I? I'm currently a research engineer at VotingWorks, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan election technology startup in the United States. I work on our RLO tool, which is a risk limiting audit software suite that facilitates risk limiting audits at large scale. And so why am I talking to you today? So RLO has recently become widely adopted in the United States. Multiple states are using them for statewide audits, several jurisdictions are using them locally, and even one state, North Carolina, has started using RLO completely on its own without any support from VotingWorks. And as we have grown, as the RLO product has been used more and more across the United States and hopefully soon elsewhere, we have begun to start thinking about threat modeling risk limiting audits. There's been a lot of work about how risk limiting audits fit into the threat model of elections overall, but there has not been a lot of work looking at what sorts of attacks can be launched against risk limiting audits. I'm going to briefly give you an outline of the talk, and then we'll get started. So first, I just want to briefly cover what an RLA is. One thing you're going to hear me say a lot is that there's more details in the paper because this is only a 10-minute talk. So I'll briefly go over RLAs, and then once we have some basic definitions and assumptions, I will give a brief look at actually how they work in practice. Then I will discuss briefly the threat model that I built out in the paper. And finally, I'll conclude by drawing some broader lessons. So first, let's look at what even is an RLA. So I think it helps to look at what problem is an RLA trying to solve. So here you see a standard election setup where on the left here, voters mark their ballots either via pen and paper or using a computer device, a ballot marking device. Then they hopefully can review their ballots, and then the ballots are deposited in a ballot box or a central scanner or a scanner of some sort, and a tally is produced. So at the end of the election, we get a result, right? In this case, Alice wins is the true result. RLAs ask the question, what happens if something goes wrong with this tally phase? Whether that be some ballots are lost or there is malware on the software systems that are used to tally the ballots, or there's a hand count done and the humans are imperfect. What happens when that goes wrong and the outcome is changed, right? So in this case, all the voters actually voted for Alice, but somehow something has gone wrong and now Bob has won. So RLAs introduce an extra step into the election process called a post-election audit, which you see here on the right, where we go and look at the physical paper ballots in a statistically robust way and use that to make sure that the outcome is correct. And if the outcome, if we find that the paper ballots don't align well with the reported outcome, then we RLAs have the power to overturn the result. So in our scenario before, if the tally produces the wrong result, the RLA can go back and correct it. Putting it another way in words, basically it's a post-election audit process that provides a specified level of confidence that the election outcome is correct. And that specified level of confidence is the risk limit. Another kind of less technical definition of it is basically it's a miniature recount with a bunch of complicated math thrown in, and the recount itself can scale depending on what the evidence is and what the outcome and the margins and that kind of thing are. So specifically RLAs, and one of the contributions of this work is noting that RLAs assume these four things. So the first thing they assume is that paper ballots are ground truth. We assume that voters mark, they imprint their preference on a physical record, and that physical record is actually what they intended. I have past work showing that may not always be the case due to usability concerns, due to, in the ballot marking device case, due to potential malware, that kind of thing. But RLAs have to assume that the paper ballots are the ground truth source for the election outcome. The second thing that they assume is that the paper is well preserved. So if the paper trail is corrupted in any way, an RLA can basically tell you nothing, right? If some ballots disappear or if they are altered after the fact, an RLA is no longer, obviously we're breaking that link back to ground truth. So RLAs can't help you there. Thirdly, RLAs assume that were we to perform a full hand count of all of the paper records, that a true outcome would be produced, right? And that is, again, if we assume paper is ground truth and we assume that counting is good, then, that counting is correct, right? That hand counts are typically correct, then the outcome ought to be that the correct winner is announced. And finally, the last thing that RLAs contribute is that full hand counts are undesirable, right? We have, certainly in the US, we have lots of complicated election infrastructure. We have lots of languages on our ballots. We have long ballots with lots of contests on them and so on and so forth. And so there's a reason that we have computer devices in the election process to count the ballots. And so RLAs take that as an axiom and say, okay, if full hand counts are undesirable, then we want a process that minimizes the amount of hand counting to get to a level of confidence that we need. So those are the four main assumptions that RLAs make that are often unstated but often implied. So how do they actually work in practice? This is a network diagram that's in the paper. I'm not going to go through it all, but essentially I just want to outline that you have five-ish main stakeholders here, right? You have the tabulation system here that produces the election outcome, whether that be hand counting or computer tabulators or whatever. You have an audit administrator who is typically a state-level election official who is in charge of overseeing the whole process and entering data and communicating and all of that. You have audit software, which is what Arlo is, as well as tools produced by Philip Stark. Neil McBurnett has tools, Free and Fair has tools, the state of Colorado maintains a tool. Basically this software helps facilitate a decentralized audit process at scale. And then we have local election officials who are the ones, they're the boots on the ground, they actually have the paper ballots, they are the ones who are doing the sampling and the recounting and so on. And then finally we have the public. And the public is obviously who we are hoping to convince here, right? The RLA should give the public some confidence that the winner won and the loser lost. In practice, how does this actually work? As I mentioned, RLAs don't sample all of the ballots when they don't have to, so they do a robust random sample, which means that one of the first steps in the process is seeding a pseudorandom number generator. Here you see 10-sided dice that are used as a seed in an election. I believe this was in Virginia. Next, once a sample has been drawn, ballots are handled and recounted as necessary. So this is an audit in Missouri. You can see these tables here where local election officials will be unsealing and hand counting ballots. Here is a closer look at that process. This is from an audit in Virginia. You can see the container of ballots here with the seals on it have been broken, and then the stack of ballots over here has been opened. And in this case, we're using a counting scale. Sometimes hand counting works, sometimes the K-cut method works. It depends. Again, there are more details in the paper. And finally, once all of the data has been collected from the audit in a given round, that data is entered into a tool, and the tool does the complicated math on the back end and tells you, does this evidence that you have gathered confirm or not confirm the outcome, right? So in this case, this was an audit in Washtenaw County, Michigan, where the first round sample of election data did in fact confirm the outcome. So it's this big complicated process. There's this large chunk of software in the middle of it that's doing a lot of the work. So what is actually the threat model here? If I were to try to subvert an RLA, what would I be trying to do? In the paper, I discussed sort of two main goals that the attacker has. First one I call a major goal, which is to cause the RLA to stop early. So if you imagine that an attacker has corrupted an election outcome, and they know that an RLA is going to be performed, what they want to do is cause the RLA to confirm the outcome erroneously, right? And in RLAs, the way that works is that the RLA terminates before it has looked at enough ballots to determine that the outcome was incorrect. So that's the major goal. A minor goal is to just force a full recount every time. And you can imagine that if election officials are weighed with this choice of doing this complicated RLA process and every time it winds up in a full hand count, maybe they're gonna think, what's the point of this? We should just not even bother. So that's sort of a minor secondary goal. And I go into a lot more detail in the paper, and it turns out that the second goal is easier to achieve than the first goal. Anyways, moving along. So our attackers, in the paper, I consider multiple capabilities that the attackers have. They can forge data, and that can be election results, obviously. That can be, it can be the pseudorandom number generator, it can be the audit tool, it can be the list of participants, it can be the seed to the PRNG. There's basically all of these different data paths that flow into the tool, and if the attacker can control those things, they can affect the outcome of the election. They can also forge messages between the parties. So if the state level election official is trying to communicate to a local election official or vice versa, the attacker can get in the middle and monkey with that process. And obviously they can tamper with evidence. And this is sort of the game over for RLAs. If you recall from our assumption slide, we're assuming that the paper is ground truth. So if that paper is tampered with, then the audit doesn't really tell us anything. So again, this is all very high level, but I just want to briefly mention some lessons that I drew from this work. The first thing is that obviously defense in depth is critical. Risk limiting audits are just one arrow in a quiver, and they actually depend on several other arrows, right? They need good chain of custody, they need physical security, and all of those things, but they also provide an extra step in the process that helps, in theory, build confidence. And one thing that I've been concerned with is that in 2020 in the United States, we had more RLAs than in our history, and yet there was still an insurrection where people invaded our capital and murdered people, right? So one thing that I'm still reckoning with, and that I would, invite the community to reckon with a little bit more, is we're doing this really complex statistical process. Is that actually convincing anyone? And my one data point that I will add in that is not all doom and gloom is that the state of Georgia did an RLA process that required them to hand count all of their ballots. And I think that is the thing that allowed their Secretary of State, who is a Republican, who is receiving tons of pressure from the previous administration in the United States, that is what allowed him to stand up and say, no, actually, our election results are correct. And I think that, had he not done that, I think January 6th in the United States would have gone differently. So RLAs may not convince the common man, but they may convince enough people with enough power that they can stop, obvious total chaos, right? So anyways, thank you for listening to my talk. I'm excited to take questions. And if you would like to reach out or anything, you can reach me at bernhard@voting.works or on Twitter at @umbernhard. Thank you so much.